What's up, cooks? Welcome to the Card Kitchen. I am the Card Chef, and today we are cooking up the top 10 decks of the week and meta report. That's right, we are doing the top 10 decks of the week and meta report. In this meta report, we are of course looking at the meta share of all the top archetypes in the game, their win rate, their top percentage, and the amount of tournaments each deck won. This week we added a couple of pieces to the pie, including Aerodactyl and Golem decks. That's right, these decks have been doing pretty good as of this week and last week as well, but we didn't add them to the pie. But this week we will be doing so. The tournaments we looked at were 7 tournaments with 268 people or more. We only looked at the top 16s to get those specific percentages that we want to look at, and a total of 4,091 players in these 7 tournaments. And with that being said, let's get in to the meta share breakdown. This is the meta share breakdown. It is a ton of different decks. This is probably the widest variety of decks that we have seen in the top of the meta. As mentioned, we added the Aerodactyl and the Golem decks to this pie. So we have Blain to represent the Blain decks, Weezin to represent the Dark decks, Aerodactyl to represent all the different Aerodactyl variants, the Golem to represent basically the new Golem Dredagon deck, the Moltres to represent the Charizard Arcanine builds, the Celebi to represent pretty much the top grass decks in the game, which either consist of Celebi Superior, Celebi and Exeggutor, or Exeggutor and Exeggutor, which is also doing pretty well. Mewtwo decks, which is represented, the split between those is Mewtwo Gardevoir, Mewtwo Gardevoir Mew EX, or Mewtwo Gardevoir and something like a Jinx instead of the Mew. Pikachu decks, we know all about these. There's a ton of different variants. There's the Raichu, the Zebstrika, the Electrode, and the Zapdos build. And then we have Misty representing the water decks. The water is a ton of different water decks consistently being played. The Starmie EX decks, the Articuno EX decks, the now Gyarados EX decks, as well as variants of all 3 of those decks being played with something like a Greninja. And then we have the card back of the game representing all other decks within the tournaments that we looked at. So Blain and the Dark decks are only about 2% each of the meta share. The Aerodactyl EX is around a 4% of the meta share. Golem, believe it or not, is around 6%. That was actually kind of surprising because I did see a lot more Aerodactyl being in the tops. We'll get into that later. However, I do believe the Golem being a higher representation of the meta share is because it got first place in the Ursi Day tournament last week, which is always the biggest tournament of the week. The Moltres decks are again only representing about 6% of the meta share right now. Those have dropped significantly since the Mythical Island has come out. The Celebi decks are representing about 9% this week. And the Mewtwo EX dropped quite a bit, almost, I think, 12% from last week. We did look at 2 more tournaments last week. We looked at 9, whereas this week we only looked at 7. However, that's still a significant drop. The Pikachu EX is representing about 16% of the meta share, and the water decks are now around 17%. All other decks that are off-cook metas that are not part of these archetypes are around 23%. And with that being said, let's get in to the win rates. So this is the win rate breakdown. We of course are going to start from smallest to largest, starting with the Blain decks. The Blain decks are only around a 36% win rate, and this is kind of interesting because through my data crunching of all the decks, I noticed that a lot of the time that there are certain players who are playing the deck who have a very high win rate, and then some that have a very low win rate. And so this could be the issue with this 36%. So basically, even though Blain is still topping, not very often, not as much as other decks. However, this week it did win a tournament. We'll get into that later. The win rate overall being played amongst all players that are playing the deck is only around 36%. The dark decks representing basically only Scolipede and Weezing really right now. There are Arbok and Weezing decks. I only looked at the Scolipede for now because those were the ones that did a lot better the start of last week. By the end of last week, they weren't doing so great, and this week they actually did very, very bad. Their win rate is only around 39%, and I don't even believe, and I'll have to see it when we get to it, because I can't remember with all the data I've been crunching, that I don't think they topped a single tournament this week, at least not in the 7 most highest player rate amongst the 7 that I looked at. As we move along, the Golem decks, even though it did win a tournament last week, is only around a 41% win rate. The mewtwo EX probably coming along with the same issue as Blain. There is a large number of mewtwo EX players, some that play really, really well, and some that just play really, really poorly. It could be due to the player or the matchups. All that stuff included, especially when you have a higher meta share. The variance between the matchups that you have can obviously vary a lot. And so Mewtwo is only around a 43% win rate. However, it did win 3 tournaments this week. We'll get into that later. The Misty Deck's win rate has dropped quite a bit. And this is probably due to the fact that Aerodactyl decks, or we should probably be calling them Hitmonlee decks, actually, is there's so much Hitmonlee being played right now, as well as Pikachu decks now deciding to go with the Zebstrika build more often than not, so that we can snipe those Magikarps that are on the bench. So that has dropped. I do believe the Misties were, or the Water decks, I should say, were around a 54% win rate last week. They are now down to 45%. The Celebi decks are also at 45%. This deck is pretty consistent. It tops around the same amount as it did previously. Its win rate is around the same. Nothing has really changed. I don't really know what Celebi is going to have to do, because they kind of keep topping, but they don't really seem to be winning all that much, to be honest. And the Moltres decks, they still have a pretty high win rate, but again, they also don't top as often, even though they do have a higher win rate overall. And it's probably because, again, they only have around a 6% meta share. So if those 6%, if the people are actually winning their matches a lot more than some of the 14% meta share of the Mewtwo, it doesn't really matter, even if Mewtwo has a lower win rate overall. The Pikachu EX has one of the highest win rates again. This deck is still one of the best decks in the game and has been since day one. In Genetic Apex all the way through to Mythical Island, it's still doing tremendously good. And then we have the new Aerodactyl EX decks, and these decks are just doing so well for so many different reasons. They have so many cards that you can tech in to really make the deck as almost as perfect as possible. You have the Marshadow so that you can get that revenge kill and trade something like a 2-for-1. You have the Aerodactyl, which again, in my opinion, the ability is not why it's being played. It's kind of like that cherry on top. It's really the fact that you have 140 body that can hit for 80 damage. There's so much electric in the meta right now, so you're hitting basically anything that's electric for 100 damage for 2 energy. And then of course you're playing the Hitmonlees, and those Hitmonlees can snipe those pesky Magikarps before they evolve into those massive Gyarados. And these decks are also teching in things every now and then, things like Tauros, things like even Mew EX, and so the win rate for these decks is doing super duper well. They're also playing things like the new Primeape, the old Primeape. I've even seen Marowak builds doing very, very good. I've seen it mixed in with Machamp. I've even seen it mixed with Golem, the old and the new. Aerodactyl is actually doing very good right now. I'm not saying it's because of Aerodactyl. However, he is the one that's in the majority of the decks himself, as well as Marshadow and Hitmonlee. It's kind of like a 3-prong package that kind of cover so many bases, right? You cover the fact that they can't evolve, you cover the fact you can get a revenge knockout, and you cover the fact that you can snipe with Hitmonlee. And with that being said, let's get in to the top in percentage. So this is the tops percentage chart. Again, we only looked at top 16s. We did not look at top 32s, even in those tournaments that have top 32s, those really big tournaments. We only looked at top 16s in the 7 tournaments that we looked at. And just in case I wasn't clear last week when we first started doing these charts, this percentage is a representation of all 16 tops across the 7 tournaments. So 100 out of 112 tops, this is the percentage of these decks that were represented within those 112 total tops across the 7 tournaments. So the Blain decks are actually, what we should do is we should start by talking about Dark. We just said that the Weezing, Dark, and Celebi decks, they did not top at all this week, which was kind of crazy because last week, especially at the beginning of last week, they were topping like crazy. That was also before the Gyarados decks were really figured out. People were bringing in the Scolipede, and people were still playing a ton of Mewtwo. As you know, the Mewtwo percentage has dropped tremendously, about 12%, so those Dark decks don't have as much value. So they got 0 tops in those 7 tournaments with 268 people or more. And now let's get into the decks that actually did top. So the Blain decks only topped, out of those 112 tops that we looked at, only 1% of the time. Again, it's still topping. It's kind of always been one of those decks that at least tops one tournament out of all the big tournaments that we kind of look at, but it rarely ever gets where you want it to be, which is obviously a win. It did win a tournament this week, but it wasn't one of the 268 or more. It was like a 256. And then if we go into the Golem decks, they still did a lot of topping. So this is why I had decided to add Golem as a part of the pie now, along with something like Aerodactyl, because we're starting, it wasn't just a one-off fluke. It did not win this week. It did win last week in the biggest tournament. However, it's still topping, so I do think it's worth adding to the pie to represent a part of the actual meta. And in case anyone's wondering, the reason why we didn't combine Golem and Aerodactyl decks together as just fighting decks is that they actually really are just 2 different decks entirely, and so I decided to look at them separately. But anyways, with that being said, let's move on. The Moltres decks are still topping around a 6%. All other decks, and this is what's like the most interesting part of this pie chart, is the fact that other decks are 10%. That's higher than the Moltres, higher than the Golem, and higher than the Blain. And I will say this now, the majority of those decks, there were some one-off decks. There was like an interest in Pidgeot deck. There was some Machamp decks. However, the majority of these other decks that were actually making tops is going to be added to the pie next week. And it's actually like this like tech box kind of like deck where it's just you're basically playing the best cards all together in one deck. It's the Greninja, the Druddigon, and the Mew EX, and sometimes teched in with something like Tauros, the new Tauros. And that deck is actually doing very well as well. It's very similar to the Gyarados EX, Greninja, and Druddigon deck, except you're removing the Gyarados and you're adding things like, again, the new Tauros and the Mew EX. Moving on, the Celebi, again, they're still topping a lot. They're in 13% of the tops that we looked at. The Mewtwo, again, also 13%. And then the Aerodactyl is also 13% of the top, which is super duper good. It's one of the 3rd highest representations of the top 16s that we looked at alongside Mewtwo and Celebi. So this is why it's getting its own piece of the pie this week. And next week it'll probably still be there. In fact, next week we might even remove the Dark because, again, it did not top at all and had a very poor win rate, even though the meta share is still Actually, the measure is really low too. It's like at 2%, right? And then we get into the water decks, still doing very good. This deck is just still super duper strong, even though it's being sniped by Hitmonlees, even though it's being sniped by Zebstricas, it's still doing very good. It's super duper strong. Once you attack into a Druddigon, you can basically knock out almost and once somebody attacks your Druddigon, you can basically knock out whatever it is that attacked it with your Gyarados, as well as your Greninja being able to place those damage counters. And then, of course, Articuno and Starmie EX are still doing pretty good as well. Mixed in with Greninja, mixed in with Gyarados, mixed in with even Vaporeon. We did look at Vaporeon decks this week, and those are still doing pretty well. I did not see a Vaporeon deck top this week, or at least not one that was noticeably a Vaporeon deck specifically. And then, of course, good old Pikachu at the top of the tops. It topped more than every other deck across the 7 tournaments we looked at and represented about a 24% of the 112 tops that we looked at. That is a tremendously huge, and of course it is because it's Pikachu EX. And with that being said, let's look at the actual decks that won tournaments. So this is the chart for the decks that won this week, and it doesn't really look all that interesting. Only 3 different types of decks won this week, and lo and behold, it's still Mewtwo EX and Pikachu EX. Last week there was a much bigger representation across the 9 tournaments that I looked at last week. There were several winners. This week, Pikachu, I looked at 7 tournaments, so this is why it's a 33%, and 11%. The Pikachu and Mewtwo EX decks both won 3 tournaments each. Interestingly enough, the Mewtwo EX won with 2 different versions, and those versions were one with Mew EX and one with Jinx. And so again, the old school style of Mewtwo EX is still winning. The new Mewtwo builds are winning as well. And of course, the Pikachu EX are winning as well. All represented by basically the Zebstrika build. Again, it has to do with being able to just snipe things like those Magikarps. And then there's so much water in the meta as well because these Gyarados decks are doing well. So even if you don't snipe one, you're still likely to win that matchup anyways. And then we have another off meta or non-archetypal deck that won a tournament, and again, it's that Tauros Mew EX mixed in with the Druddigon Greninja kind of package that people are playing right now. That deck is doing really well, and again, I'll probably add it to the piece of the pie next week as its own deck, but it also depends how well it does next week. It did do pretty well last week, but not enough to actually get it in there. And then this week it did well enough that I could put it in next week if it continues to do well. But with that being said, let's get into the top 10 decks that I chose to showcase this week and spotlight for their creativity or just their placements in tournaments and things like that. And let's get into it. So I thought it would be fitting to start with this deck. This is the one I've been talking about the whole time, about possibly adding it to the pie chart next week as its own deck. And it's kind of, I'm going to probably be calling it a Tauros deck. It's really the one deck that Tauros is probably doing the best in, and it's really due to the fact that you have the Greninja Druddigon package. It seems like these 2 cards, these 2 Pokemon mixed together in a deck seem to be doing very well. So it kind of seems almost like a package now, kind of like a Koga Weezing package, except this one is basically like a free damage package where your Greninja is getting free damage once it's evolved, and anytime your opponent attacks into Druddigon, it's free damage, free value. And then what you have is you have either the 1 Mew or the 1 Tauros that you can decide at the beginning of the game, depending on the matchup, which one you want to load up first, as they both take 3 energy. The cool thing about this too is you could possibly play, and I'm sure they are, both the fire and the water energy, because Mew and Tauros both require colorless attachments, and your Greninja only requires 1 water, and your Druddigon is fire and water. You can probably play both so that you can attack with any of your guys, whereas in something like the Gyarados build with your Druddigon and Greninja, you can't play the fire energy. This deck is of course playing the Professor's Research Pokeball and Sabrina's, but then we're also playing the one Giovanni to get those breakpoints and potions to keep possibly something like your Druddigon online for an extra turn. So basically you're saying I'm going to get an extra free 20 damage, or to heal up something so that you can pass over a breakpoint from your opponent's side of the board. And then they're also playing to Leaf. Leaf is good in this deck because both Tauros and Druddigon are to retreat, and because you want your Druddigon to be that one card in the front more often than not at the beginning of the game, and you need to get it out at some point, because once you get 1 or 2 turns of damage for free on your opponent, and either your Tauros or your Mew is loaded up, you can almost guarantee that you're probably going to knock out whatever EX Pokemon that is in your opponent's active spot. So it's going to be interesting to see where this deck goes. And like I said, I'll probably add it to the chart next week. And with that being said, let's get into the next deck. So this is the next deck, and it's a Blain deck. And this one specifically won a tournament this week. It was not a part of the breakdown for the meta report that we just went over. However, I did notice that it won a tournament, and Blain is still topping outside of that one tournament that it won, and so I felt like it was interesting enough to talk about it. In fact, I kind of want to do a deep dive at some point into the Blain decks because we have the new Rapidash. I would like to see which decks are actually doing better, the old version with the old Rapidash or the new version with the new Rapidash. And in this case, this player who won the tournament actually won with 2 different Rapidash. So as you can see, we're playing the new Ponyta at 2, but then 1 Mythical Island Rapidash and 1 Genetic Apex Rapidash. And then of course the rest of the deck is pretty standard. It's the 2 Ninetales lines, the 2 Professor's Research, 2 Blain, 1 Sabrina, 1 Giovanni, 2 Pokeball, 2 X Speed, and 2 Potion. That's super duper standard for a Blain deck. I personally like to play a 5th basic in my decks, and I also like to play 2 Giovanni. I don't think I usually play potions, but this deck is pretty low on health, and so it might be worth playing things like the potions to make sure that you can stay online as long as possible to kind of get those knockouts. Again, this deck is still very good. It's not as good as the other decks. It doesn't place as much. It's not played as much, and it doesn't win as much, but it's still a top tier deck. It's still getting into top 16s in tournaments with 250 or more people, which is pretty impressive. And with that being said, let's get into the next deck. So this is the next deck, and it's a Blastoise deck. So there's actually a lot of interesting cooks on this top 10 list. Again, this isn't usually I'm not putting it in order of the top 10 decks that are actually the best decks. It's more like a top 10 spotlight list, and this was a very interesting build. It was a Blastoise build with 2 Articuno and 1 Druddigon. So that Druddigon's still very much an MVP this week, being played in a bunch of decks, getting a ton of value in all those decks. In this deck specifically though, however, I am very surprised we are only playing 1 Druddigon. You would think you would want to be playing 2 so that you can increase the chances of starting with that Druddigon in the front line to start getting that free value from it. They're instead playing the 2 Articuno. This could be due to the fact that, of course, we're playing Misties because it's a Blastoise deck, and you might want to be able to just get that free roll Misty on the Articuno at the beginning of the game and then just start controlling the game right from the get-go. Again, this deck is playing to Leaf. It's something you often see in Druddigon builds, and also because Articuno has 2 retreat cost as well, it is very valuable to have the Leaf in the deck. But again, this deck actually won a tournament. This won a full-on tournament with 250 or more people. It was super impressive. I love to see Blastoise in it. It's not the first tournament that it's won, but it's probably like the second tournament it's won. The first time it was when everybody found out that baby Mewtwo was a solid wall. This is taking that same idea, except using Druddigon and Articuno as that wall, and then just getting a ton of extra value out of those cards as well. And with that being said, let's get into the next cook. So the next deck we have on the list is another starter Kanto Pokemon. This time it's a Venusaur EX, and this deck got 6th place in a tournament with 250 people or more. Again, this is super duper interesting, and this deck, and I don't even know how they did it, because if you think about it, you're not just playing a Venusaur EX and a Celebi, but you're also playing the Superior, and not only that, you're playing both these stage 2 Pokemon at 2 full lines each. So you have a ton of Pokemon. You have 13 Pokemon in this deck, and you're only playing 1 Erica, which I also found super interesting. So this deck, of course, if you get the Superior online, your Venusaur is super cheap. Your Celebi gets a ton of extra energy attached, so it has options. But again, how do we get into these lines to get them most value out of these cards? Obviously, this player found a way to do so, and got a 6th place finish with this deck. Very minimal trainer cards being played, again, because there's 13 Pokemon in the deck. I know that people have been trying to make Venusaur and Superior work, and this player obviously did it. He must have had tremendous matchups and tremendous draws in order to make this work. Congratulations to that player, and I would love to try this deck out. I'm not sure how well I'm going to do with it, because again, 2 stage 2s in one deck is super hard to pull off. And with that being said, let's get into the next deck. So this is the next cook, and these cooks keep getting crazier and crazier. This Melmetal Deck, that's right, you heard me correctly, Melmetal, made it into a top 16 of a very big tournament with 250 or more people, and it actually got only 16th place, but still it made a top 16, so I felt it was very necessary to showcase this deck. And again, it's teching in Mew and teching in Druddigon. These 2 cards, I said it last week, I'll say it again, these are probably the MVPs of either week, and probably will continue to be the MVPs going forward. They're 2 of the best cards in the game right now, because they can basically go in any single deck, and this one is no different. Of course, the Melmetal takes less damage from your opponent's attacks, and so it's super bulky, and you need time to kind of load it up, because it takes 4 energies to load up. You'll of course want to be able to tank with something like your Druddigon, and again, this is a surprising thing. We're only playing 1 Druddigon. I don't know why we're not playing 2, but this player still got a top 16, so who am I to judge? But you would think that you would want to be able to get that Druddigon in the active more often than any of your other Pokemon. But what you might be doing with this deck is you might actually be willing to tank with 1 Melmetal if you don't get that Druddigon and load up a second one, or tank with a Melmetal and load up the Mew EX. So Melmetal works very good in 2 different ways in this deck. 1, it could be a tank to load up your Mew, or 2, it could be you can use something else to tank while you load this one up in the back. Of course, we're playing the Leafs again, because this deck is very energy heavy to retreat your Pokemon, both the Druddigon and the Melmetal. We're also playing a blue, which I absolutely agree with. You're already playing a deck that is going to be taking less damage on something like your Melmetal, so you want to be able to increase that with your blue, as well as keep them in line as long as possible with the potions, which this deck is also playing. Both the blue and potion work very, very well with your Druddigon as well, so the synergy is there. I love this cook. I would love to try this deck out too. There's so many cooks I've been seeing in tournaments lately that I just want to try, and probably will in the future. But with that being said, let's get in to the next deck. So the next deck on the list is an Aerodactyl EX deck, and most Aerodactyl EX decks that have been doing very well include something like a Primeape, whether it's the new one or the old one. Usually more often the new one for 1 energy doing 50 damage. However, in this deck, we actually aren't playing Primeape at all. Some other decks are playing Marowak as well. I've seen those top a couple of times this week as well. But this one is very interesting. This one to me, and I'm going to call this deck Tech Box, is basically you have a ton of Pokemon that are all considered like kind of tech cards mixed in to build one big deck. So of course you have the Aerodactyl EX, which is super duper good. You can play it for the attack, 2 energy for 80 damage, as well as getting that cherry on top of its ability. You have the Marshadow as well, so you can get that revenge kill for just 2 energy. You're doing 100 damage. You have the Hitmonlee to be able to snipe. You have the Tauros to be able to attack into those EX Pokemon, and you have that Mew EX to be able to take out and one-shot those big Mew EX, or something like a Charizard EX as well. You have so many options for so many different games, and that's what's so good about these Aerodactyl decks. I said it before, I'll say it again. You have so many cards that you tech in those standard Aerodactyl builds, and now you have this one build with extra tech with the Mew and the Tauros as well. This deck is also playing the Leaf, which is very surprising because every card except for the Tauros is only 1 retreat cost, but we're actually also playing the X Speed, so we're playing both Leaf and X Speed, which I understand why, because again, in a deck like this that is super tech heavy, you have with a ton of options, you want those options on the board when you need them. When you need that Hitmonlee out, you don't care if you're wasting a Leaf on it. You want that Hitmonlee out so you can snipe the Magikarp. When you have that Tauros loaded up and they have a Pikachu on board, you want it on the forefront in the active spot. When you need that revenge, well, with the revenge kill, it doesn't really matter because you're already had a Pokemon knocked out, which means you could just bring in the Marshadow. But this deck is super easy to retreat. You have the 2 Leaf, the 2 X Speed. You can even have something like the Dome Fossil in the active spot, and Aerodactyl already evolved on the bench, and then just discard the other Dome Fossil to get a free retreat. This deck is super cool, super interesting, and I love Aerodactyl right now. It's actually doing a lot better than I thought it would in the game, and it's not just because of Aerodactyl. I don't want people to think that. That's not what I think. It's because of how the deck is built with so many different options to be able to counter any deck that you're up against. And with that being said, let's get in to the next deck. So this is the next deck, and it's a Machamp EX Deck. And of course, as you can see, again, we have a Druddigon and a Mew in the deck, the 2 MVPs coming out of Mythical Island. And the cool thing about this deck is it actually kind of combines both the Golem deck and the Aerodactyl EX deck. So what it's doing is it's replacing the Golem, the 2 Golem lines with the 2 Machamp EX lines, and playing the Druddigons in the front to be able to tank and get that free value. And then what you have is similar to the Aerodactyl EX decks is all the tech cards. You have the Marshadow and the Hitmonlee and of course the Mew EX. We've already talked about the Marshadow and the Hitmonlee and how good they are as tech cards in those Aerodactyl builds. And of course, the Mew EX and everything that comes along with that as well. So this deck combines those two fighting decks that we see a lot of, the Golem deck or the Aerodactyl kind of tech boxy deck, and combines them in together. And instead of playing the Golem, of course, as we just said, we're playing the Machamp EX, which is really, really good. We know it has that perfect curve. So even if you don't have the Drudagon out, if you play the Machop, 1 energy, attack, Machoke, 2 energy, attack, Machamp, 3 energy, attack, is doing 190 damage, which is super duper fantastic. And that perfect curve will knock out any Pokemon in the game currently with 190 damage over 3 turns, as long, of course, there is no potions involved. This deck is really cool. I would love to see a Golem version of this. I'm sure there already is Golem versions of this that I just haven't seen yet. But this deck is really awesome, and the fact that you're able to combine those two decks, and we've seen this done in the past before, combining the Arcanine and the Charizard decks into one deck and make them one really good deck. And so I'd like to see where this goes and the idea of this goes in the future. And with that being said, let's get in to the next deck. So the next deck on the list is an Exeggutor EX Deck, and I feel comfortable with calling this an Exeggutor EX Deck and not a Celebi or obviously a Mew deck, because we're only playing one Celebi and we're playing 3 Exeggutor, 2 of them being the Exeggutor EX and 1 of them being the baby Exeggutor from the genetic Apex packs. So we're not playing the new Exeggutor, which makes sense because we're not playing Superior either. And so this deck also did very well. It got into a top 16 in a tournament with 250 more people, and it works really well together because your Exeggutor EX and your baby Exeggutor and your Celebi require very minimal energies. So because all your Exeggutors only require 1, you can now take the time to build up either the Celebi with a ton of energy or your Mew EX with 3 energy for the genome hacking attack, so that you can bring them on into the game and you have a ton of time to do it because you're playing 2 Potion and 2 Erica. So as long as your Exeggutor, which you will have the higher chance of starting with your Exeggutor EX in the forefront, and even if you don't, you're playing 1 Leaf and 1 XP to be able to get either the Mew or the Celebi out of the active spot. You bring in the Exeggutor, you tank for a ton of time while doing a ton of potential chip damage, between 40 to 80 every single time you attack, and then you heal up like crazy and you just build up those cards in the back. And honestly, I think Celebi decks in general might start doing this more. It kind of feels like the old school Venusaur Exeggutor build where like you tank and get a ton of chip damage with your Exeggutor while you slowly build your Venusaur in the back. Except in this case, you don't have to evolve anything in the back row. You can just place the 4 energy that you would have put on your Venusaur anyways. You now put on the Celebi EX, and then you can do anywhere between obviously 0 to 200 damage potentially. So you don't need the Superior in this deck, I don't think, and this version of the deck might actually start to do better than the Celebi Superior builds. I would like to see where this goes in the future, of course. And with that being said, let's get in to the next deck. So this next deck is one hell of a cook, I will say that. It is a double Pidgeot deck, taking in a Blain package with Blain, 2 Blains and the 2 different Rapidash. So of course we're playing the 2 Pidgey and 2 Pidgeotto, and then we're playing 2 Pidgeot EX and 1 Pidgeot from Genetic Apex, and then we're playing the 2 Ponyta from the new Mythical Island, and then 1 of each of the new Rapidash. We're then playing the obviously Professor's Research and Pokeballs, but then 2 Blains and 1 Giovanni to get that extra damage in this aggressive deck. And then we're playing 1 X speed to get anything out from the forefront that we don't want there, and 1 Pokeflute, which makes a ton of sense because we want to be able to combo that card with either of our Pidgeot, because both Pidgeot work very well with the Pokemon Flute. The Pidgeot from Genetic Apex being able to bring out the new Pokemon you put on the bench on to the active spot, or to get that full damage output from the Pidgeot EX by putting another Pokemon on your opponent's bench. We can also combine the super aggressive Rapidash and Blain combo with your old Pidgeot, baby Pidgeot from your Genetic Apex, because you can basically use that card, bring out something that you can hit over, so something like 70 damage or less, and hit it with either Rapidash and a Blain. Or you can go for the big one shot. You can get something that is 130 or less and try to get that lucky coin flip with the new Rapidash, hit it for 100 plus the damage from Blain, which would be 130 damage. So this deck is super duper interesting. It got 14th place in a tournament with 250 or more people, and I would love to see more stuff like this. I love Pidgeot EX. I like the old Pidgeot. I never would have thought to combine them with something like a Rapidash Blain kind of package in there. I think that's really cool. I have played this similar deck with Behemoth because Behemoth hits for 70 damage for 1 energy, just like has the same effect like Pidgeot EX, where when the Pokemon that are on the bench, if you have 3 of them, you hit for more damage. And again, like I said, it would be 70 for 1, but I never thought you would do it in this way, getting 70 damage with your Rapidash. So it's pretty cool. And with that being said, let's get in to the next deck. So this is the next deck on the list, and the last but certainly not least. And again, it's another kind of tech boxy deck. The last one we looked at was a Aerodactyl EX version where you played the Aerodactyl EX and then the other tech cards like Marshadow, Hitmonlee, Mew, and Tauros pretty much all at one. In this case, we are not playing the Aerodactyl EX or the Dome Fossils. What we're doing instead is we're actually playing 2 Farfetch'd, a second Marshadow, and a second Hitmonlee. So this deck as well also got a top 16 and a 250 or more person tournament, and it's super interesting because these tech box kind of decks seem to be doing really well, and I would like to see how these decks continue to evolve. So of course this deck, outside of the Marshadow, Hitmonlee, Mew, and Tauros, which we've already talked about to death at this point, the interesting thing here is the inclusion of the Farfetch'd. And so I guess the idea is you want to be able to just knock out anything that you can, and usually you would see in these types of decks is probably something like a Primeape, but I guess what they wanted to do is to, in order to make more deck space to be able to play other important trainers that you want to be playing, is they took out the new Primeape or decided to just not play it and play the Farfetch'd instead, because that 40 plus 10 is still very valuable. So when you're attacking with your Farfetch'd and playing it along with a Giovanni to be able to knock out anything like an Exeggutor even, who's 50 HP instead of 60, you can knock it out in one shot. You can bring out that Hitmonlee, knock out a Magikarp on the bench. You can, of course, build up that Tauros or that Mew and decide which one you want to start building at the beginning of the game, depending on the matchup. And, of course, you have that Marshadow because you know that you're most likely going to be losing a Farfetch'd pretty early on in the game. You can get that revenge shot in very easily because, first of all, your Farfetch'd is only 60 HP, and because there's so much electric and it's weak to electric, your Farfetch'd is more than likely going to be knocked out really quickly, but will probably also get at least one turn in of attack doing 40 damage, which means across 2 turns you're doing a minimum of 40 from your Farfetch plus 100 from your Marshadow. That knocks out an Articuno, a Zapdos, a Moltres, a Celebi, a Mew, a Pikachu. So many huge EX Pokemon. So you're doing a ton of valuable trade-offs, doing 2-for-1s. And then even if your Marshadow gets knocked out very early on the next turn, you might already have something like a Mew or a Tauros built up in the back. Anyways, that is it for the meta deck breakdown, the meta report, as well as the top 10 decks of the week that I decided to showcase. And with that being said, like, subscribe, and share. Leave a comment in the comment section below. And as always, keep cooking.